The crisp air of early October carried the scent of decaying leaves and distant wood smoke. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind of quiet, sun-drenched day that felt like a reward for surviving the summer heat. David Owen was in the barn, calibrating the pressure gauge on his apple press, when a shadow fell across the open doorway. He looked up, his movements unhurried. A man in a pressed polo shirt the color of a faded robin's egg stood there, holding a clipboard like a shield. "Mr. Owen." The man's voice was smooth, practiced. It was the voice of someone paid to deliver inconvenient news with a smile. "That's me," David said, wiping a smear of grease from his knuckles with a red shop rag. He didn't recognize the man, but he recognized the type. "Gerald Finch, from the Architectural Control Committee," the man announced, taking a half-step into the barn before seeming to think better of it. His polished loafers were ill-suited for the dusty concrete floor. "Just doing a routine walkthrough of the community perimeter. We've had a report about the rustic state of your barn." He gestured vaguely at the weathered gray siding. "It's impacting the viewshed from the upper lots on Whispering Pines Lane." David set his wrench down on the workbench with a soft, metallic click. He stepped out of the barn's shadow and into the sunlight. Squinting slightly, he was a tall man, built with the lean, functional strength of someone who has spent a lifetime working with his hands. His face was lined by sun and time, but his eyes were clear and direct. "This is my property, Mr. Finch," David said, his tone polite but firm, "not a community perimeter." Finch offered a conciliatory smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well, yes, of course. But the barn is visible from a common area, which falls under CC&R Section 9.2, Maintenance of External Structures within the Community Viewshed. The board just wants to ensure all properties maintain a harmonious aesthetic." He glanced past David, his eyes flicking to the narrow gravel road that ran alongside the barn, before disappearing into the orchard. Then, his gaze tracked a faint set of tire tracks that veered off the gravel and cut a path through the grass between two rows of Honeycrisp trees. "And while I'm here, we've also had some discussion about this path." David followed his gaze. The tire tracks were a fresh wound in the otherwise pristine orchard floor. "That's not a path," David stated. "That's trespassing." "The board understands it's used as an occasional shortcut by residents of Evergreen Court," Finch said, his voice dropping into a confidential murmur. "Just for convenience. The president, Mrs. Winthrop, feels it's a non-issue, a neighborly accommodation." David's posture didn't change, but a stillness settled over him. "The easement is the 12-foot gravel road, as surveyed and recorded with the county. It's for ingress and egress to my property and the two lots behind it. Anything beyond that gravel is my private land." He took a deliberate step toward Finch, not aggressively, but with an authority that made the other man instinctively shift his weight back. "You are currently standing on that private land, Mr. Finch. The access easement is over there." He pointed with his chin toward the gravel. "Please stick to it." Finch's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. He consulted his clipboard. A nervous tick. "Right. Well, the board will be sending a courtesy notice regarding the barn's paint. We recommend a color from the pre-approved palette. Mountain sage or riverstone would be excellent choices." He gave a crisp nod, turned on his heel, and walked back to the gravel road, his steps careful and precise. David watched him go, the clipboard a small rectangle of white against the vibrant green of the manicured lawns in the distance. He looked from the retreating figure of Finch to the tire tracks scarring the earth, and then to the old barn his father had built with his own two hands. He felt a familiar sensation, one he hadn't experienced since his last tour of duty, the quiet, methodical hardening of resolve. This wasn't about a coat of paint. It was about lines. The ones on a map. The ones in the dirt. And the ones you draw inside yourself when someone decides to walk straight through you. He walked back into the barn, his movement slow and deliberate, as if he were packing a parachute. The battle had not yet been declared, but the first scout had just crossed the border. That evening, the scent of applewood from the fireplace filled David's small study, a framed survey map of the property, dated 1978, hung on the wall above his desk. It was a beautiful piece of cartography, with hand-drawn contour lines and his father's precise, architectural script labeling every feature: the old well, grandfather's max, West Ridge. He was on a video call with his daughter, Sarah, a second-year law student at Chapel Hill. Her face, framed by a disorderly stack of textbooks, was a welcome sight. Viewshed. They're really citing a viewshed clause for a barn that's been there for 40 years, Sarah asked, pushing her glasses up her nose. That sounds like selective enforcement. Dad. It's a pretext, David said, leaning back in his chair. Murphy, his loyal German Shepherd mix, rested his head on David's knee, sensing the tension. The real issue is the shortcut. A woman named Karen Winthrop, the HOA president, has been driving her Bentley straight through the orchard. The Bentley. The one you told me about last month. The very same. Finch from the ACC all but admitted she's the one doing it. He called it a neighborly accommodation. Sarah sighed, the sound staticky over the laptop speaker. Dad, you need to be careful. These people weaponize procedure. You can't just be right. You have to be right in writing. I know. David swiveled his chair to face a heavy, 3-ring binder on the corner of his desk. The spine read, Maple Hollow Estates Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions. He'd inherited it with the property, a thick, uninviting brick of legalese he'd only ever skimmed. He opened it now, the pages stiff and smelling of old paper. When Mom and I sold off that northern parcel back in '95, the lawyers said this came with it. Dad never would have agreed to it. He probably didn't have a choice if the rezoning put him inside the development's boundaries. Sarah said, find the section on easements. It should be in the property use division. He flipped through the pages. Past rules on satellite dishes, lawn ornaments, and fence heights. Finally, he found it. Article 8. Section 8.4 Easements. He ran his finger down the subclauses until he landed on the one he was looking for. With a yellow highlighter, he carefully traced over the words. Rugger 8.4.2 Access Easement. Lot 1A Owen Property. An exclusive common access easement is established for the purposes of ingress and egress only. Said easement is strictly limited to the 12-foot wide 12V gravel path, as defined in the master plat recorded in the Coldwater County Registry. Book 4, page 28. Here it is, David said, holding the binder up to the camera. Limited to the 12-foot wide gravel path. Clear as day. He looked back at the framed map on the wall. He'd studied it 1,000 times over the years. He walked over and pointed to the thin, dotted line that represented the easement. Look at this, Sarah. The easement is drawn so precisely here, almost like Dad knew someone might try to push its boundaries someday. That's your Exhibit A, Sarah said, a hint of pride in her voice. But they'll ignore it if they can. They'll try to drown you in notices and citations for other things to wear you down. The barn paint is just the first shot. Don't let them change the subject. Every response you send, you bring it back to the easement and the trespass. She paused. And please, don't just be a stubborn old soldier about it. Be strategic. Document everything. Communicate only in writing. Create a paper trail they can't argue with. He smiled. When did you get so smart? When I realized my tuition was being paid for by apples and stubbornness. She quipped, just promise me you'll play the game by the rules, even if they aren't. I promise, he said. But as he looked at the highlighted clause, he knew this was a game whose rules were designed to favor the house. His only advantage was the truth, and he had to make sure that truth was documented, certified, and unassailable. After the call, he sat at his desk for a long time, the binder open before him. This land was his only real asset, the fund for Sarah's education and his own modest retirement. This wasn't just a squabble over a shortcut. It was a direct threat to his financial security, to his legacy. He pulled out a fresh legal pad and a pen. At the top of the page, he wrote October 5th, 9:15 a.m. Visit from ACC Representative Gerald Finch. He began to write, his script as precise as his father's on the old map, detailing every word, every glance, every unspoken threat. The paper trail had begun. 10 days passed. The leaves on the maples at the edge of the property turned a fiery crimson. David followed his daughter's advice to the letter. He spent an afternoon applying a fresh coat of sealant, not paint, to the barn. A clear protective layer that preserved its weathered character while technically constituting maintenance. He then composed a polite, formal email to the HOA board. To the Maple Hollow Board of Directors. This email is to confirm that maintenance on the barn at 145 Orchard Lane was completed on October 9th. Furthermore, I wish to formally reiterate that any travel off the 12-foot gravel path, as defined by the access easement in CC&R, Figure 8.4.2, and the recorded plat map, Book 4, page 28, constitutes trespassing on my private property. I request the board inform residents accordingly to prevent any future incursions. Sincerely, David Owen. He received an automated reply confirming receipt. Nothing more. He also installed a simple but clear sign at the point where the tire tracks veered off the gravel road, a professionally printed aluminum sign that read, Private property. No vehicular access beyond easement. On the morning of October 15th, the mail carrier's truck did not just slow as it passed his mailbox. It pulled all the way up his driveway. David met the carrier at the door. Got a certified for you. David, the carrier said, holding out a clipboard and a crisp green and white envelope. Need a signature. David signed the slip, a knot tightening in his stomach. Certified mail was never good news. It was the physical embodiment of a conversation someone didn't want to have in person. He thanked the carrier and went inside, placing the envelope on the kitchen table. It felt heavier than it should. He slid it open with a kitchen knife. The letterhead was thick and embossed with the Maple Hollow Estates logo. The title was stark, Formal Notice of Violation. Date October 14th, 2023. To David Owen, 145, Orchard Lane, from Maple Hollow Estates, HOA Board of Directors, RE violation of CC&R, for 7.3 signage. Dear Mr. Owen, this letter serves as formal notice that your property is in violation of the Maple Hollow Estates covenants, conditions, and restrictions. An unapproved sign has been installed near a common access easement, per CC&R Figure 7.3. All signage visible from common areas must be pre-approved by the Architectural Control Committee to ensure community harmony and aesthetic consistency. You are hereby directed to remove the unapproved signage within 10 days of the date of this notice. Failure to comply by October 25, 2023, will result in further enforcement action, including the scheduling of a formal hearing before the board and the potential levying of fines. This notice is sent in accordance with the association's bylaws and enforcement procedures. Sincerely, the Maple Hollow Board of Directors. Below the typed line was a signature, written in a sharp, aggressive blue ink that pressed deep into the paper. Karen Winthrop, President. David read the letter twice. They had completely ignored his email. They had ignored the core issue of her trespassing and pivoted. Just as Sarah had predicted, they were using a clause about aesthetic harmony to punish him for defending his property line. It was a masterful piece of bureaucratic aggression, polite, procedural, and utterly disingenuous. The threat was no longer implied. It was official, dated, and delivered with the full, albeit misplaced, authority of the association. This was the declaration of war, printed on expensive paper and signed by the enemy herself. He placed the letter, the envelope, and the certified mail receipt into a new manila folder. On the tab, he wrote in bold, black letters, Violation number 1, signage. The game had officially begun. The evening of the hearing, November 10th, was cold and damp. David drove to the community clubhouse, a building he'd only ever entered once for a potluck years ago. Inside, the room was oppressively warm and smelled of cinnamon-scented air freshener. About a dozen residents were scattered in the audience chairs. At a long table at the front of the room sat the board Karen Winthrop in the center, flanked by Gerald Finch of the ACC and a severe-looking woman who was meticulously taking notes. Karen, dressed in a sharp blazer, looked serene and authoritative. She smiled thinly as David took a seat in the front row. Welcome, everyone, to the November board meeting. Our first item of business is a compliance hearing for Mr. David Owen of 145 Orchard Lane. When his name was called, David walked to a small lectern facing the board. He had his folder with him. Its contents neatly organized: a copy of the violation notice, a photograph of his sign, a printout of CC&R FIRA 7.3, a copy of the easement clause, FIRA 8.4.2, and a large, high-resolution print of the county plat map. Mr. Owen, Karen began, her voice smooth as polished stone. The board has called this hearing regarding your failure to comply with violation notice, HOA 23-114, concerning unapproved signage. Do you have anything to say before we vote on the matter of fines? I do, David said calmly. He placed the photograph of his sign on the table. This sign was placed entirely on my private property, not in a common area. Its purpose was to clearly mark the boundary of the access easement to prevent further trespassing, an issue I have already brought to the board's attention. He then laid out the plat map, as you can see from the officially recorded plat map, and as stipulated in your own CC&Rs under Section 8.4.2, the easement is explicitly limited to the 12-foot gravel path. The sign is located a full 10 feet from that path. On my land, therefore, CC&R Section 7.3, which governs signage in common areas, does not apply. He had made his case clearly, factually, and without emotion. He had used their own documents against them. For a moment, there was silence. Gerald Finch shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Karen did not look at the map. She kept her eyes fixed on David, a placid, unreadable expression on her face. Thank you for your perspective. Mr. Owen, she said, the words dripping with condescension. However, the board's interpretation of the governing documents is what matters in this room. The sign is visible from the easement, which the board considers part of the community's aesthetic fabric. Your sign is industrial. It disrupts the pastoral quality of the neighborhood. It's a sign that says private property. David countered. It's meant to be clear, not decorative. And it is the board's position that its stark nature constitutes a visual nuisance under the broad community standards outlined in Bylaw 12B1, Karen said. Not missing a beat. We are a community that values harmony, not harsh metal signs and implied accusations. It was a kangaroo court. His evidence was irrelevant. Her interpretation, however illogical, was the only one that mattered. She had already decided the outcome. The board will now vote on the levying of a $100 fine for non-compliance. Karen announced, all in favor. She and Finch raised their hands immediately. The third board member, the note-taker, hesitated for a second before her hand went up slowly. The motion carries, Karen declared, a flicker of triumph in her eyes. Mr. Owen, you will receive a formal notice of fine in the mail. You have 30 days to remit payment. If you remove the sign, the fine will be waived. Next item on the agenda. David stood at the lectern, gathering his papers. The other residents in the room stared, some with sympathy, others with a palpable fear of being the next one called to the front. He had been publicly overruled, his evidence dismissed, his rights ignored. It was a calculated act of humiliation, designed to show everyone in the room who held the power. As he walked back to his seat, he didn't feel anger. He felt the cold, clear focus of a man who now fully understood the nature of his enemy. This was not a dispute to be won with facts in a hearing room. It was a war that would have to be won on a different battlefield altogether. The notice of fine arrived the very next day. As promised, David paid it immediately. It wasn't an admission of guilt. It was a strategic move. Paying the $100 fee gave him standing as someone financially harmed by the board's decision. He sent the check with a letter, stating it was being paid under protest, and enclosed a photocopy with another note for his own meticulously kept file. That weekend, during his call with Sarah, he recounted the hearing. They didn't even look at the map. Honey. She cited a vague clause about community standards, and that was that. It's called a SLAP strategy, Sarah said, her voice tight with frustration. Strategic lawsuit against public participation. Or, in this case, a SLAP-style fine. They bury you in frivolous actions to silence you and drain your resources. You can't fight them alone on their home turf. You need to find their weakness. She paused. HOAs are non-profits. Dad, their meeting minutes, their financial records. A lot of that is public, or at least discoverable by homeowners. You need someone who knows how to navigate the county bureaucracy. Her advice sparked an idea. The next day, David drove into town, not to his lawyer's office, but to a small, unassuming bungalow with a sign in the front yard that read, E. Vance, Research and Archival Services. Eleanor Vance was a woman in her late 60s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that David immediately respected. She had been the Coldwater County clerk for 30 years before retiring. If anyone knew where the bodies were buried in the county's paperwork, it was her. David laid out his folder on her tidy dining room table. I'm being targeted by my HOA president, and I need to know why, he explained simply. Eleanor listened patiently, reviewing his documents, her fingers tracing the lines on the plat map. Karen Winthrop, she said, the name tasting sour in her mouth. Her father used to throw his weight around the planning commission like he owned the county. Looks like the apple didn't fall far from the tree. She tapped the violation notice. This isn't about a sign. This is about that land. You're in her way. But it's just a shortcut, David said. Nothing is just anything with people like that, Eleanor countered. She accepted his case, her fee surprisingly reasonable. I enjoy puzzles, she said with a wry smile, and I despise bullies. 2 weeks passed. David received another violation, this time for the unapproved color of his front door, which had been forest green for as long as he could remember. He logged it, filed it, and sent a polite query asking for the date the color was added to the unapproved list. The harassment was becoming predictable. A slow, bureaucratic strangulation. Then, on a gray afternoon in late November, Eleanor called. "I think I have something," she said, her voice crackling with excitement. "Can you meet me at the office?" When David arrived, Eleanor had a stack of papers spread across her desk. "I started with the HOA's publicly filed meeting minutes for the past year," she explained. "It's mostly boring stuff, pool maintenance, holiday decorations. But one meeting, from about 6 months ago, caught my eye." She slid a page toward him. It was a copy of the agenda and minutes from a board of directors meeting in May. One agenda item read, "Discussion of Evergreen Court Development Proposal." But the corresponding section in the minutes below it was completely blacked out. A thick, impenetrable rectangle of redaction. "This is highly unusual," Eleanor said. "They can redact for legal privilege or sensitive personnel matters. But a development proposal, that should be a matter of record. They're hiding something." She then pushed a second set of documents, forward corporate filings from the state. "So I looked up who owns the undeveloped land adjacent to your orchard. The parcel they call Evergreen Court. It's owned by a shell corporation called Pinnacle Group LLC. And then I looked up the vendors the HOA has paid for community landscaping services over the last year. The payments are unusually high, and they all go to one company, Winthrop Landscape and Design." She let the name hang in the air. "I did a little more digging. The registered agent for Winthrop Landscape is a man named Richard Winthrop, Karen's cousin." David felt a cold knot form in his stomach. A kickback scheme. "It's more than that," Eleanor said, her eyes gleaming. "Look at the registered agent for Pinnacle Group LLC, the developers." She pointed to a name on the filing. "Douglas Shields. He's a partner at the law firm that represents Karen personally. It's all connected. David, the landscaping payments, the development proposal, the harassment against you. This isn't a coincidence." The mystery of the redacted minutes was no longer just a curiosity. It was the key. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, the pieces clicking into place with the satisfying certainty of a solved puzzle. "It's a classic squeeze play, David. But it's not just about a shortcut. It's about your entire 9 acres. She laid out a county zoning map next to the corporate filings. Her finger traced the boundaries of David's orchard, then the adjacent, undeveloped parcel, owned by Pinnacle Group LLC. Pinnacle wants to build a new luxury enclave. "The villas at Evergreen Court," she explained, tapping the redacted agenda item. "But look at the topography. Their parcel is landlocked from the main road, the only viable access point for construction vehicles, and later for residents, would require a new, wide road." Her finger slid across the map and stopped dead in the middle of David's orchard, right through the heart of your property. The existing easement is too narrow and winds too much for their purposes. They need to acquire your land, or at least a significant portion of it, to get the county to approve their development plan. The full picture came into focus with sickening clarity. The constant trespassing wasn't just Karen's personal convenience. It was a deliberate strategy. She was establishing a pattern of use, David said, the words feeling like lead in his mouth. "Trying to create a de facto easement through my land." "Exactly," Eleanor confirmed. "And when you pushed back," she pivoted, "the HOA violations, the fines, the harassment. It's a coordinated campaign to make your life so miserable, so expensive, that when Pinnacle Group finally makes you a lowball offer for the land, you'll be desperate enough to take it. She's not just the HOA president. She's an undeclared business partner in the development deal. The kickbacks from her cousin's landscaping company are likely just a way to skim money from the HOA to fund her legal war against you." The fight was no longer about a sign, a barn, or a shortcut. It was about his home, his legacy, everything his father had built and he had sustained. Karen Winthrop didn't just want to drive through his orchard. She wanted to bulldoze it. "What's in the redacted minutes?" David asked, his voice low. "My guess, a presentation from the developer. A discussion of the board's role in encouraging you to sell. Proof of her conflict of interest. Proof that the entire board knew they were overreaching their authority from the very beginning." Eleanor said, "If we can get the unredacted version, we can blow this whole thing wide open." A profound and chilling sense of violation washed over David. It wasn't the impersonal violence of war. It was the intimate, personal malice of a neighbor systematically trying to ruin him for profit. He thought of Karen's serene, condescending smile at the hearing, and finally understood the cold calculus behind it. Before he left, he stopped by a small cafe and overheard a snatch of conversation that solidified everything. A woman in a business suit was speaking into her phone in hushed, panicked tones. "I don't care what the statement says. I need another extension." "No. The deal hasn't closed yet. It has to. It's the only way." It was Karen. When she turned, she saw him. Her face went pale, then hardened into a mask of pure venom. She snapped her phone shut and walked out without a word. She wasn't just greedy. She was desperate. Eleanor's research had provided the motive. But that brief, overheard moment of panic revealed the engine driving her fear. A desperate person was a dangerous one. And David knew, with absolute certainty, that Karen was about to escalate things dramatically. Karen's desperation manifested faster than David could have anticipated. A week after his meeting with Eleanor, 2 official-looking envelopes arrived on the same day. The first was from a prestigious downtown law firm, the one Eleanor had identified as representing Pinnacle Group LLC. It was a lawsuit, not from the HOA, but from Karen Winthrop personally. It was a textbook slap suit, accusing him of harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and creating a hostile living environment. It was filled with frivolous claims and exaggerated legalese, designed not to win in court, but to bury him in depositions and legal fees. The second envelope was from the County Department of Agriculture. It was a formal notice of investigation. An anonymous complaint had been filed questioning the organic practices at his orchard. The complaint alleged improper use of non-organic pesticides and contamination from his poorly maintained barn. His USDA organic certification, the very thing that allowed him to sell his apples at a premium to local markets and restaurants, was now in jeopardy. It was a direct attack on his livelihood. "She's trying to cut off your funding," Sarah said over the phone that night, her voice shaking with rage. "She's fighting a war on 2 fronts, one to drain your savings with legal bills, and one to destroy your income. Dad, this is serious." "I know," David said. He was looking out the window at his neighbor's house, a small, well-kept cottage at the far end of the lane. Arthur, a widower in his late 70s, was meticulously trying to touch up the peeling paint on his trim, his movements slow and pained. The HOA, under Karen's rule, had been fining him for months for that same peeling paint. Fines David knew Arthur could barely afford on his fixed income. The code enforcement officer, a young man who looked apologetic, arrived the next morning. David walked him through the entire orchard, showing him the locked shed where he stored his organic-approved treatments, his meticulous spray logs, and the buffer zones he maintained. The officer was thorough, but seemed to know the complaint was likely baseless. "Everything seems to be in order, Mr. Owen," the officer said as he was leaving. "But I have to file a report, and there will be follow-up soil and tissue testing. It's the procedure when a complaint is filed." The procedure. The word echoed in David's mind. It was the weapon of choice for people like Karen. A few days later, Eleanor called with the news they'd been waiting for. "I got them," she whispered, her voice triumphant. The unredacted minutes. "A friend of a friend who works in the management company's corporate office owed me a favor. It's exactly what we thought. David." It explicitly details a presentation by Pinnacle's lawyer, Douglas Shields, and Karen, recusing herself from the vote, but not the discussion, where she advocates for a phased compliance strategy to encourage Mr. Owen's cooperation. This was the smoking gun. This was the proof of a conspiracy. But as David reviewed the document, Eleanor pointed out something else. "I also got the internal records of the code enforcement complaint," she said softly. "It wasn't anonymous. The complaint was filed by your neighbor, Arthur." David felt the air leave his lungs. Arthur Gentle. Quiet Arthur. It made no sense. "Wait," Eleanor continued. "Look at this." She showed him a printout of Arthur's HOA account ledger, in the week before he filed the complaint. The HOA had suddenly escalated his fines for the peeling paint and sent him a notice of intent to Leanne on his house. The pieces fell into place with a horrifying click. Karen hadn't just filed the complaint. She had coerced a vulnerable, elderly man into doing her dirty work, threatening him with the loss of his home if he didn't comply. She had turned neighbor against neighbor. David now held evidence that could not only win his case, but could also utterly destroy Karen. But using it would mean exposing Arthur, dragging a good man into the center of a legal firestorm, and revealing his moment of weakness to the entire community. He looked across the field at Arthur's small house. That evening, he saw Arthur on his porch, staring at the peeling paint, his shoulders slumped in defeat. David now faced a choice that went beyond legal strategy. He could win at any cost, or he could win with his principles intact. The annual homeowners meeting was in 1 week. He had to decide what kind of victory he was fighting for. The community clubhouse was packed for the annual homeowners meeting. The air was thick with tension, and the low murmur of dozens of private conversations. Homeowners, many of whom David had never seen before, filled every chair. They were drawn by the rumors, the lawsuits, and a shared sense that something fundamental in their community was about to break. At the front table sat Karen Winthrop, flanked by the board and a nervous-looking representative from the property management company. Beside the podium, a large digital clock had been set up, its red numbers glowing 5:00. David had registered to speak during the open forum when his name was called. A hush fell over the room. He walked to the podium, his steps measured and calm. He placed a single, neatly organized folder in front of him. Karen smiled, a tight, predatory curl of her lips. "Mr. Owen, you have 5 minutes. The clock will begin when you start speaking." David looked not at her, but at the assembled homeowners. He nodded respectfully. "My name is David Owen. My family has owned the orchard at the edge of this community for 3 generations. For the past 2 months, I have been the subject of a targeted harassment campaign by this board and its president, Karen Winthrop. They will tell you this is about a sign or the color of a barn. It is not. It is about an attempt to illegally pressure me into selling my land to a developer with whom Ms. Winthrop has a secret financial partnership." The clock started 4:50. A ripple of shock went through the crowd. "Let's start with the facts," David said, his voice even and strong. He held up a large, foam-backed copy of the county plat map. Exhibit A. This is the recorded plat map. It clearly defines the access easement as a 12-foot gravel path. The board has been fining me based on actions taken on my private property, outside their jurisdiction. They knew this from the beginning. 4:15. He replaced the map with a new document. Exhibit B. These are the official minutes from the board meeting on May 12th. You will note the section on the Evergreen Court Development Proposal is redacted. He then held up a second copy. And these are the unredacted minutes, which I have obtained. They show Ms. Winthrop and the board discussing a phased compliance strategy to encourage my cooperation with the developer. This is not governance. It is a conspiracy. Gasps echoed through the room. Karen's face had become a pale, rigid mask. 320. This conspiracy was funded by you. David continued, looking out at his neighbors. Exhibit C. These are the HOA's financial records, showing over $20,000 in questionable payments to a landscaping company owned by Ms. Winthrop's cousin, for services that were never fully rendered. Your money was used to finance a personal vendetta. The murmuring in the room grew louder, angrier. 2:30. When this failed, David said, his voice dropping slightly. They escalated. They filed a frivolous lawsuit to drain my resources, and they attacked my livelihood with a malicious code enforcement complaint, threatening my orchard's organic certification. He paused, holding up another document. The complaint was filed by a neighbor, a good man, an elderly resident on a fixed income, who this board has been systematically fining into potential foreclosure. He looked directly at Karen. You threatened to put a lien on his home if he didn't file this complaint against me. You used his fear to do your dirty work. 110. The room was dead silent. This was the moment. He could name Arthur. He could complete the kill. Instead, he took a black marker from his pocket and drew a thick, deliberate line through Arthur's name on the document he held. I have redacted this man's name from my evidence, David said, his voice ringing with conviction. Because unlike this board, I believe in protecting the vulnerable members of our community, not using them as pawns. My fight is with you, Miss Winthrop, not with the neighbors you victimized. It was a masterful stroke. In that one act, he had proven both Karen's villainy and his own character. The moral high ground was his, unequivocally. 035. He squared the papers on the podium. My time is almost up, but this is not the end. It is the beginning of accountability. He turned his head slightly. For the remainder of my time, I cede the floor to my attorney. A man in a simple dark suit stood up from the front row. It was Tom Harland. 030. The clock ticked down. Tom's voice was calm and clear. My name is Tom Harland. On behalf of Mr. Owen, we have filed a countersuit against the Maple Hollow Estates HOA for abuse of process and breach of fiduciary duty. We have also filed a suit against Karen Winthrop personally for tortious interference and conspiracy. We have submitted our evidence to the county prosecutor. Thank you. 003, 002, 001, 0000. The clock flashed 0. The room erupted. The moment the clock hit 0, the carefully controlled artifice of the meeting shattered. The room descended into what could only be described as procedural chaos. Homeowners were on their feet, shouting questions, demanding answers. The board members looked stunned, powerless. Karen Winthrop sat frozen, her face ashen. The color drained from her cheeks. A man from the back of the room, someone David recognized from the local hardware store, stood on a chair. I make a motion, he yelled over the din, his voice booming. I move to recall the entire board of directors, effective immediately. Seconded came a chorus of voices. The representative from the property management company, a man named Henderson, who had been trying to shrink into his chair, finally spoke up, his voice trembling slightly. That motion is out of order. A recall requires a formal petition. Then I make a motion to authorize an immediate, independent financial audit of this association's books, shouted a woman near the front. Seconded. Henderson looked wildly from the angry crowd to Karen, as if seeking guidance. But she was gone. In the uproar, she had slipped out a side door, a silent retreat from the empire she had built, and that had just crumbled around her. Seeing the sheer scale of the legal and financial liability unfolding before him, Henderson made a swift, corporate decision. He tapped the microphone, his knuckles white. "Ladies and gentlemen, please," he pleaded, "given the serious allegations presented here tonight, and the clear conflict within the community, Oak Ridge Management must announce that we will be severing our management contract with Maple Hollow Estates, effective in 30 days, pending legal review. We cannot continue to represent an association in this position." His announcement was a bombshell. He was cutting them loose, abandoning the board to face the consequences alone. The engine of their power, the management company that sent the notices, collected the fines, and enforced their will, had just quit. In the stunned silence that followed, Arthur, David's elderly neighbor, slowly got to his feet. His voice was quiet, but carried across the room. I think we owe Mr. Owen an apology," he said, looking at David. "He stood up for all of us." One by one, other residents nodded. The anger in the room began to subside, replaced by a sense of shared purpose. They started organizing right there, appointing an interim committee to oversee the recall petition and the search for a new management company. David didn't say another word. He simply stood by the podium, watching as the community he had felt so alienated from began to heal itself, taking the first, difficult steps to reclaim their neighborhood from the corruption that had taken root within it. The war was over. The reconstruction had just begun. Months later, the orchard was preparing for winter. The trees stood bare against a steel-gray sky, their branches like stark black skeletons. The ground was hard with the first deep frost. The turmoil of the autumn felt like a distant storm. A new, resident-led board was now in place. Their first official act was to send a formal, written apology to David Owen, delivered by hand by the new president, a retired teacher with a kind face and a firm handshake. All fines, fees, and violations against him and Arthur were formally rescinded and expunged from the records. The threatening letters had stopped. The lawsuits were settled quietly, with Karen's personal liability insurance paying a significant sum to David, most of which covered his legal fees. The final surprise came not in a letter, but in another call from Eleanor Vance, who had been retained by the new board to assist with the audit. "You're not going to believe this, David," she said. "We finally got a look at Karen's real financial situation through the settlement discovery. She was on the verge of personal bankruptcy. She had leveraged everything to buy that mansion. And the development deal with Pinnacle wasn't just a side project. It was a last-ditch effort to save herself. The kickback she was hoping for would have been her lifeline. It didn't excuse her actions, but it cast them in a new, pathetic light. She wasn't a queen in a castle. She was a desperate gambler on a losing streak, willing to burn down a whole community to save herself. The Pinnacle Group, facing legal challenges and a now hostile community, quietly withdrew their development proposal. The land next to the orchard would remain wild. At the first community meeting of the new year, David Owen, who had accepted a volunteer position on the new Architectural Control Committee, stood up to speak. The tone in the room was different now, collaborative, hopeful. "We've spent a lot of time talking about rules and violations," David began, his voice calm. "But rules are only as good as the community that upholds them. Our old board used our funds to punish and divide. I'd like to propose we use them to help and to build." He outlined a simple idea, a community care fund, seeded by the damages he had won in his settlement. The fund would offer small, no-interest loans and grants to residents with legitimate financial hardships who needed help making repairs to their homes like a new coat of paint for an elderly neighbor on a fixed income. It was a way to turn the instrument of his harassment into a tool for collective good. The proposal was met with unanimous, heartfelt applause. One crisp spring afternoon, David was walking the perimeter of his orchard, Murphy trotting happily beside him. He stopped at the place where the gravel easement met the grass. There were no tire tracks now. A new family had moved into Karen's old house, a young couple with children whose laughter he could sometimes hear drifting across the field. He had met them last week when they came to buy a basket of his first-of-the-season apples. They had stayed on the path. The orchard was waking up, green buds dotting the branches. The community was waking up, too. The conflict had left scars. But like the old barn, those scars had become part of its character, a reminder of its resilience. He had fought a battle he never wanted, not for a piece of land, but for a principle. And in the end, he hadn't just won back his peace. He had helped a neighborhood find its soul.